Imagine an ocean. It is wide. It is deep. It is dangerous. For thousands of years, people on one side did not know the other side existed. Then, one day, ships appeared on the horizon. Those ships changed everything. In less than 300 years, 3 continents became connected: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Gold traveled east. People traveled west. Some by choice, many in chains. Ideas crossed the water. Diseases crossed the water. Revolutions crossed the water. The Atlantic Ocean became the center of the modern world. And the story of how that happened is one of the most powerful, painful, and important stories in all of human history. This is the story of the transatlantic world. Hi, and welcome to Daily English Origins. Are you learning English? Great! Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's get started. The word transatlantic means across the Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is the second largest ocean on Earth. It separates 2 groups of continents. On one side, you have Europe and Africa. On the other side, you have North America and South America. For most of human history, the people on these 2 sides did not know each other. They lived separate lives. They had different languages, different religions, and different ways of living. But in the late 1400s, everything changed. European sailors began crossing the Atlantic. What followed was not just exploration. It was a collision of worlds. A collision is when 2 things crash into each other with great force. And this collision between the old world and the new world created the modern world we live in today. To understand the transatlantic story, we must first understand where it began, in Europe. In the 1400s, Europe was a continent full of energy and ambition. Ambition means a strong desire to achieve something great. Kings and queens ruled powerful kingdoms in Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands. These nations were competitive. They wanted wealth, power, and land. Trade was the key to all of these things. At this time, the most valuable goods in the world came from Asia. Spices like pepper and cinnamon, silk, and precious gems. These products were called luxury goods, items that were expensive, rare, and highly desired. But the land routes to Asia were long and dangerous. They crossed deserts and mountains. And they were often controlled by the Ottoman Empire, a powerful Muslim state. This made trade slow and costly. European merchants and kings had one big dream: find a faster, cheaper route to Asia. That dream pushed sailors toward the unknown ocean to the west. While Europe was looking westward, Africa was a continent of incredible richness and diversity. Diversity means having many different types of people, cultures, and ideas. Africa was home to some of the world's great empires. The Mali Empire in West Africa controlled enormous gold and salt trade routes. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, was so wealthy that when he traveled to Egypt in 1324, he gave away so much gold that he actually caused inflation in the region. Inflation happens when too much money enters a market, causing prices to rise and money to lose value. The Kingdom of Congo, the Great Zimbabwe, the Swahili coast cities. These were not small, weak societies. They were sophisticated centers of trade, art, and government. But Africa also had one vulnerability that would be exploited in terrible ways. A vulnerability is a weakness that can be used against you. That weakness was internal conflict. Kingdoms sometimes fought each other. And this internal fighting would later be used by outsiders to take people as slaves. That story comes soon. But first, we must cross the ocean. On the other side of the Atlantic, two enormous continents waited, completely unknown to Europeans. The Americas were home to tens of millions of people. Some historians believe the population was as large as 60 to 100 million people before European contact. In the south, the Inca Empire stretched along the mountains and coast of South America. It was one of the largest empires ever built. The Inca had no writing system, but they recorded information using quipu, a clever system of colored, knotted strings. In Central America, the Aztec Empire controlled a vast network of cities and trade. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat on an island in a lake. It had more than 200,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time. In North America, hundreds of different nations lived in forests, plains, and deserts. The Haudenosaunee, also called the Iroquois, had already created a complex democratic system, a government where people had a say in decisions long before Europeans arrived. These were not empty lands. They were full of people, culture, and history. This is important to remember. Now we return to Europe and to the moment that started everything. Portugal led the way. Portuguese sailors, backed by their government, began exploring the coast of Africa in the early 1400s. They were searching for a sea route around Africa and east to Asia. By 1488, a Portuguese explorer named Bartolomeu Dias had sailed around the southern tip of Africa, a place now called the Cape of Good Hope. Hope was the right word. This route opened the door to Asia by sea. But another sailor had a different idea. His name was Christopher Columbus. Columbus was Italian, but he worked for the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic instead of east around Africa. Most educated people at the time already knew the earth was round. The problem was that Columbus made a major mistake. He dramatically underestimated the size of the earth. He thought Asia was much closer than it really was. In August 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After 36 days at sea, his crew was exhausted and frightened. Some wanted to turn back. Then, on October 12, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana shouted, "Land! Land!" Columbus had not reached Asia. He had reached the Caribbean islands, islands off the coast of what we now call the Americas. He called the people he found there Indians because he believed he was in the Indies near India. He was wrong, but his mistake changed the world forever. When Columbus arrived on the island he called San Salvador, he met the Taíno people. The Taíno were peaceful, generous, and skilled. Columbus wrote in his diary that they would make good servants. This moment tells us something important about the mind of the European explorers. They did not come simply to meet people. They came to claim, to own, and to exploit. To exploit means to use people or resources unfairly for your own benefit. Spain quickly moved to establish colonies. A colony is a territory that one country controls and settles in another land, usually taking power away from the people already living there. The Spanish conquistadors, the word means conquerors, followed Columbus. Men like Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 and within 2 years had destroyed the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in Peru by the 1530s. How did small groups of Spanish soldiers defeat enormous empires? 3 main reasons. First, they had advanced weapons, guns, cannons, and metal armor. Second, they had horses, which the Americas had never seen, and which terrified enemies. Third, and most devastatingly, they carried diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity. Immunity means natural protection in the body against a disease. Millions of Native Americans died. Some historians call it a demographic catastrophe. A demographic catastrophe means an event that destroys a huge portion of a population. The world had collided, and the collision left deep wounds. After the first conquests, Europe quickly realized something extraordinary. The Americas were not just a mistake on the way to Asia. They were something far more valuable. The New World had gold. It had silver. It had fertile land, land good for growing crops. And it had something Europeans wanted desperately, the possibility of enormous wealth. Spain began shipping silver from mines in Mexico and Peru back to Europe. So much silver crossed the ocean that it actually changed European economies forever. Prices rose across the continent because suddenly there was far more money in circulation. But to create wealth, you need workers. The Spanish first tried to use Native Americans as forced labor, but millions had died from disease. A new solution, a horrifying solution, was developing. Portuguese traders had already been buying enslaved Africans and selling them in Europe since the mid-1400s. Now, someone had a terrible new idea. Bring enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work in the New World. This idea would create the largest forced migration in human history. A migration is the movement of people from one place to another. This one was not a choice. The transatlantic world was taking shape, built on 3 points: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ships moved between all three. Goods moved, ideas moved, and people, some free, most not, moved too. The machine had begun to turn. The transatlantic system did not grow randomly. It grew into a very organized pattern. Historians call it the triangle trade, because if you draw the routes on a map, they form a triangle across the Atlantic Ocean. Here is how it worked. The first side of the triangle. European ships left ports in England, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands, carrying manufactured goods, cloth, guns, iron, and alcohol. They sailed south and east to the coast of West Africa. The second side of the triangle. In Africa, European traders exchanged these goods for enslaved people. African kings and merchants, sometimes caught in their own political conflicts, sold prisoners of war and captives to European buyers. The enslaved people were then loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. This journey was called the Middle Passage. The third side of the triangle. In the Americas, enslaved Africans were sold and forced to work on plantations. A plantation is a large farm that grows one main crop, usually sugar, tobacco, cotton, or rice. The products from these plantations, sugar, rum, tobacco, cotton, were then shipped back to Europe to be sold for enormous profit. Round and round the triangle turned for over 300 years. It made European merchants, ship owners, and colonial planters extraordinarily wealthy, and it was built entirely on human suffering. Of all the parts of the transatlantic story, the Middle Passage stands as one of the greatest crimes in human history. The Middle Passage was the ocean crossing from Africa to the Americas. For enslaved people, it was a journey of pure terror. People were taken from their homes, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes sold by rival groups, sometimes captured in raids. They were marched to the coast in chains. They had already lost their freedom, but worse was coming. On the ships, enslaved people were packed into the lower decks like cargo. Cargo is goods carried on a ship, but these were not goods. They were human beings. They were forced to lie side by side, chained, in spaces so small they could barely move. There was almost no fresh air. There was almost no light. The journey took between 4 and 12 weeks. During that time, disease spread rapidly. People died from dysentery, smallpox, and dehydration. Dysentery is a painful illness of the stomach caused by infected water or food. Dehydration means not having enough water in the body. Some enslaved people jumped into the ocean rather than continue the journey. Some refused to eat. Acts of resistance, of refusing to accept what was being done to them, happened even in those dark ships. Historians estimate that between 12 and 12.5 million Africans were taken from their continent during the entire slave trade. Approximately 1 to 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone. These were not numbers. These were mothers, fathers, children, farmers, artists, leaders. People with names, families, and futures stolen. Those who survived the Middle Passage arrived in the Americas to face another kind of suffering. Enslaved people were sold at auctions. An auction is a public sale where items, or in this terrible case, people, are sold to whoever pays the most money. Families were separated. Husbands were taken from wives. Children were taken from mothers. A person could arrive in a new land, not speaking the language, knowing no one, and with no hope of returning home. On the plantations, the work was brutal. In the sugar colonies of the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, enslaved people cut sugarcane under the hot sun for 12 to 16 hours a day. Sugarcane has sharp edges that cut the skin. The mills that processed the sugar were dangerous. Accidents were common. The plantation system used violence to maintain control. Planters used physical punishment, strict rules, and fear. Enslaved people could not legally marry. They could not learn to read or write in many colonies. They had no legal rights, and yet they built cultures. They created music, language, food, and religion. They found ways to maintain dignity and community under impossible conditions. Dignity means a sense of self-worth and pride. This is one of the most remarkable facts of the entire story. Even in the darkest conditions, human resilience survived. Resilience means the ability to recover from terrible hardship. The enslaved people did not arrive in the Americas as empty vessels. They brought their world with them, inside their minds, their memories, and their hearts. Languages from West Africa shaped new languages in the Americas. In the United States, words like okra, yam, banjo, and gumbo all come from African languages. In Brazil and the Caribbean, African languages mixed with Portuguese, French, and Spanish to create entirely new ones. Religion crossed the ocean too. In West Africa, people practiced rich spiritual traditions, honoring ancestors, using music and rhythm in worship, and believing in a connected spiritual world. These traditions did not disappear. They transformed. They mixed with Christianity and indigenous beliefs to create new religious traditions. Voodoo in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and the spiritual Baptist faith in Trinidad, for example. Food crossed the ocean. Rice cultivation, the careful farming of rice, was brought to South Carolina and Georgia by enslaved Africans. They had been expert rice farmers in Senegambia and Sierra Leone. Without their knowledge and skill, entire agricultural economies would not have existed. Music crossed the ocean. The rhythms, call and response singing, and emotional power of African music would eventually give birth over many generations to blues, jazz, gospel, and ultimately much of modern popular music. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a road for European ships and African captives. It was also a road for culture, knowledge, and human creativity. Hey, quick pause here. If you are enjoying this story and learning English at the same time, please give this video a like and subscribe to Daily English Origins. It takes just 1 second, and it helps us make more stories like this one for you. Okay, let's continue. While enslaved Africans built the wealth of the New World, European nations competed fiercely to control as much of it as possible. Spain controlled enormous territories in Central and South America. Portugal controlled Brazil. England, France, and the Netherlands fought for control of the Caribbean islands and North America. This competition sometimes became war. England and France fought repeatedly over their American colonies. Pirates, independent sailors who attacked and robbed ships, were sometimes secretly hired by European governments to attack their rivals' ships. These government-approved pirates were called privateers. To manage their empires, European governments created powerful trading companies. A trading company is a business that organizes and controls trade over a large area. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and the Royal African Company all had enormous power, almost like small governments themselves. They could make laws, raise armies, and control entire regions. These companies operated using a principle called mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic idea that says a country becomes rich by exporting, selling, more than it imports, buys. The colonies existed under this idea purely to benefit the home country. The colonists, and certainly the enslaved people, existed to make the mother country wealthy. This created growing resentment. Resentment means a feeling of anger and bitterness at being treated unfairly. And resentment, over time, leads to revolution. The transatlantic story is not only about trade and slavery, it is also deeply about religion. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought Christianity with them, and they used it in complicated ways. On one hand, the Catholic Church sent missionaries to the Americas. A missionary is a person who travels to new lands to share their religion. These missionaries, men like Bartolomé de las Casas, sometimes tried to protect Native Americans from the worst violence of the conquest. Las Casas was a Spanish priest who witnessed terrible cruelties and wrote powerfully against them. He argued that Native Americans were fully human and deserved rights and dignity. On the other hand, religion was also used to justify conquest. European leaders argued that spreading Christianity gave them the right to take land and control people. This idea that Christian civilization was superior and had the right to expand was called the doctrine of discovery. It gave legal and moral cover to colonization. For enslaved Africans, Christianity was a complex experience. Some slaveholders used the Bible to justify slavery. They told enslaved people to obey their masters. But enslaved people read the Bible differently. They saw themselves in the stories of Moses and the Israelites, a people held in bondage waiting for freedom. Christianity became not just a tool of control, but also a source of hope and resistance. Religion in the transatlantic world was never simple. It could justify oppression and it could inspire liberation. Liberation means the act of being set free. By the mid-1700s, The transatlantic world was deeply connected, but it was also full of tension. Tension means pressure that builds up between opposing forces. In North America, British colonists were growing frustrated. They paid taxes to the British government in London, but had no representation, no voice in that government. They said, "No taxation without representation." This was a simple but powerful idea. If you make rules for us, we must have a say in those rules. In 1776, the 13 American colonies declared independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, stated that all men were created equal and had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a revolutionary idea. A revolution is not just a war. It is a fundamental change in who holds power and how society is organized. But there was a painful contradiction at the heart of this revolution. A contradiction is when two things you believe or say are opposite to each other. Thomas Jefferson wrote about liberty and equality, while he himself enslaved over 600 people throughout his lifetime. The American Revolution declared freedom for colonists, but not for the African people whose labor had built much of the colonial economy. Still, the ideas in that declaration traveled. They crossed the Atlantic. They arrived in France, where a revolution of a different kind was about to explode. And they arrived in the Caribbean, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people heard the words liberty and equality and decided, those words belong to us too. The fire was spreading, and the next revolution would shake the transatlantic world to its very foundation. In the late 1700s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western side of the island, now called Haiti, was the richest colony in the entire world. It produced more than half of Europe's coffee and nearly half of its sugar. That wealth was built on the backs of approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans, governed by a small class of white French planters. Then the ideas of the French Revolution arrived. In 1789, France declared that all men had liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Enslaved people in Saint-Domingue heard those words, and they acted. In August 1791, a massive uprising began. An uprising is when people rise up together against an unjust power. It was one of the largest slave rebellions in history. The leader who emerged was a man named Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint had been born into slavery. He had taught himself to read. He was a brilliant military strategist, a person who plans battles with great skill and intelligence. Toussaint organized the formerly enslaved people into a powerful army. They fought against French forces, British forces, and Spanish forces, sometimes all at the same time. For over a decade they fought. Toussaint was eventually captured by Napoleon's forces through treachery, deception, and betrayal, and died in a French prison in 1803. But his revolution did not die with him. On January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared independence. It became the first black republic in the world, the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to be born from a successful slave revolution. The word Haiti comes from the Taino word Haiti, meaning land of high mountains. Napoleon, humiliated and weakened, sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States shortly after. The Haitian Revolution, in a very real way, helped double the size of the United States. The transatlantic world had been shaken. The enslaved had become free. The impossible had happened. The Haitian Revolution showed that enslaved people would fight for their own freedom. But another fight was happening in the drawing rooms, churches, and parliaments of Europe and America. The abolition movement was growing. Abolition means the complete ending of something. In this case, the ending of slavery. In Britain, a group of activists, many of them Quakers and evangelical Christians, began campaigning against the slave trade. One of the most important was a man named William Wilberforce, a member of the British Parliament. For nearly 20 years, Wilberforce introduced bill after bill to abolish the slave trade. He was rejected again and again. The slave trade was too profitable. Too many powerful people benefited from it. But the movement kept growing. Formerly enslaved people added the most powerful voices of all. Olaudah Equiano, a man who had been enslaved and had bought his own freedom, published his autobiography in 1789. An autobiography is the story of a person's life written by that person. His book sold widely across Britain and America. People read it and could no longer pretend they did not know what slavery really meant. In 1807, Britain finally passed the Slave Trade Act, making the buying and selling of enslaved people illegal across the British Empire. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act freed enslaved people throughout most of the British Empire. In the United States, the fight was longer and bloodier. Slavery became the central issue tearing the nation apart. The contradiction that had existed since 1776, liberty for some, chains for others, could not hold forever. By the mid-1800s, the United States was a nation divided. The northern states had industrial economies and were moving toward abolition. The southern states had plantation economies entirely dependent on enslaved labor. The tension between these two worlds finally exploded. In 1861, 11 southern states left the United States to form the Confederate States of America. A civil war is a war between people of the same country. The American Civil War lasted 4 years and killed approximately 620,000 soldiers, the deadliest war in American history. Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Emancipation means the act of being freed from control or slavery. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were legally free. It did not instantly free everyone, but it changed the meaning of the war. Now the Union, the northern states, was fighting not just to preserve the country, but to end slavery. When the war ended in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed. An amendment is a formal change or addition to a law or document. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the entire United States. 4 million formerly enslaved people were legally free. But freedom on paper and freedom in real life are not always the same thing. The long road toward true equality, economic, political, and social, had only just begun. The transatlantic world left behind a complicated legacy. A legacy is everything, good and bad, that a past event leaves behind for future generations. The economies of the Americas were built on stolen labor and stolen land. The descendants of enslaved Africans faced centuries of discrimination, poverty, and exclusion even after legal freedom. Discrimination means treating people unfairly because of their race, religion, or other characteristics. And yet, the cultural legacy of Africa in the Americas is breathtaking. The music of the United States, blues, jazz, gospel, soul, hip-hop, has African roots. The food of the American South, gumbo, okra, black-eyed peas, rice dishes, has African roots. The religious traditions of Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti carry African roots. Languages across the Americas carry African words. Architecture carries African influence. The very DNA of millions of people across the Western Hemisphere tells the story of two continents meeting across an ocean. In Latin America, the mixing of European, African, and indigenous peoples created entirely new cultures, new races, new languages, new identities. Brazil became the most racially diverse country on earth. Caribbean islands became crossroads of languages, foods, and rhythms found nowhere else. The native peoples of the Americas also left permanent marks. Place names across the United States, Canada, and Latin America come from indigenous languages: Mississippi, Chesapeake, Yucatan, Patagonia. Agricultural crops that Native Americans developed: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, transformed European and global diets forever. The transatlantic world was a world of terrible violence, but it was also a world of extraordinary human creativity and survival. The effects of the transatlantic system were felt just as deeply in Europe and Africa. In Europe, the wealth generated by the slave trade and colonial plantations fueled the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the period in the 1700s and 1800s when machines began to replace human and animal labor, transforming economies and societies. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, Bordeaux, and Lisbon grew wealthy from transatlantic trade. Banks, insurance companies, and textile factories were financed by profits from slavery and colonies. Some historians argue that without the transatlantic trade system, the Industrial Revolution, and therefore the modern economy, would have developed much more slowly, if at all. The wealth of the West was built in large part on the suffering of African people and indigenous peoples. In Africa, the consequences were devastating and long-lasting. Historians estimate that the slave trade removed between 12 and 15 million people from the continent over 4 centuries. Entire communities were destroyed. Political instability grew as African kingdoms fought each other, often for the purpose of capturing people to sell. Population growth slowed. Economic development was disrupted. Then, in the 1800s and 1900s, European powers colonized almost the entire African continent, dividing it up among themselves, with no regard for existing nations, languages, or cultures. This colonization was made easier because the slave trade had already weakened so many African societies. The effects of those decisions are still being felt today in the economic inequalities between nations, in borders that divide ethnic groups, and in the ongoing conversations about justice and repair. We began this story with an ocean, wide, deep, and dangerous. That ocean connected 3 continents. It carried explorers and conquerors, merchants and missionaries, enslaved people and revolutionaries, ideas and diseases, gold and grief. The transatlantic world was not a clean story. It was not a simple story of heroes and villains, though there were certainly both. It was a story of human beings, brilliant and cruel, courageous and fearful, greedy and generous, all pulled together by the currents of history. What we can say clearly is this: the modern world was born in that ocean. The languages you hear in New York and Sao Paulo and Kingston and Lagos were shaped by those ships. The music you listen to today carries rhythms that cross the Atlantic in the hearts of people who had nothing left but their memories and their humanity. And what can we learn? We learn that connection is powerful, but connection can be used to build or to destroy. We learn that ideas travel: liberty, equality, dignity. And once an idea is free, it is very hard to imprison again. We learned that human resilience is extraordinary. That even in the darkest conditions, people find ways to create beauty, community, and hope. The transatlantic world ended legal slavery, but its full reckoning, its complete understanding and repair is still happening. In museums, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in conversations between people of different backgrounds trying to understand each other. That ocean is still speaking to us. The question is whether we are listening,